Okay, so look, I'm Lena and I messed up. I know that now. I think I knew it then too, but in that way where you push it down because it doesn't feel like a big deal in the moment. But now it's the only thing I can think about. It was just a joke. That's what I keep telling myself, like the words will rewrite the past, smooth it over, make it something less than what it was. I remember exactly where we were. Our kitchen, late, dishes stacked in the sink even though I told him I'd do them earlier. Mark was standing by the fridge, rubbing his shoulder the way he always does when he's tired. And I don't know why I said it, not really. It wasn't meant to hurt. You're not as young as you used to be. I even laughed, tried to nudge his arm like it was some harmless little jab the way couples do. The way we used to. He didn't laugh, not even a chuckle. He just looked at me for a second like he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before. And then he shut the fridge real slow, like he was thinking about something, and walked away. That should have been the moment I stopped and thought about it. That should have been when I asked if something was wrong. But I didn't. I just shook my head and kept scrolling through my phone like nothing happened. And that's the part I can't stop replaying. I don't know when things started changing between us, but if I had to pinpoint a single moment where the ground shifted just enough to crack, it was that night. It wasn't like he stormed off or gave me the silent treatment. That would have been easier to clock, but instead it was small things. The way he sighed more, the way he went to bed earlier like he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and the way he started pausing before answering when I talked to him, like he had to think about his words before saying them out loud. But I didn't take it seriously. Mark and I had been together too long for something like that to matter, or at least that's what I told myself. Love isn't fragile, right? It doesn't break because of one sentence. And yet it felt like something had lodged between us, something I couldn't quite name but could feel. I caught myself watching him more. He wasn't doing anything different, not really. Same routines. Same way he set his coffee cup on the counter too close to the edge, even though I told him 100 times it was going to spill one day. But there was a tightness to him now. Like he was waiting for something, or maybe just waiting for me to notice. The worst part is I did, and I ignored it. Instead, I focused on other things. My job, the way my friend Rachel was always complaining about her husband and how much worse her marriage was than mine. A little thrill of attention from the guy at work who complimented my hair one day. It wasn't flirting, it wasn't anything, but I liked it. And maybe that should have been my first clue. I wasn't unhappy, not exactly. But I wasn't excited anymore either. I used to love how Mark and I could challenge each other, how we'd have debates about everything from politics to what the best kind of peanut butter was. And now we barely talked about anything that wasn't practical. The grocery list. The bills, the way the neighbor's dog kept digging under the fence. It was easy, too easy to tell myself that was normal. That's just what happens when you've been with someone long enough. The fire doesn't burn out exactly, it just becomes something else, something quieter. But that night in the kitchen when I made that joke, I realized something I wasn't ready to say out loud. I wasn't sure I liked the quiet. I should have told him that. I should have told him something. But instead, I let him walk away. And now here I am, trying to piece together how I ended up here, telling this story like I can still change the ending. Maybe I already know I can't. The thing about moments like that, ones that matter more than you realize at the time, is that they don't explode. They don't announce themselves with fireworks or alarms. They just sit there quiet and still, waiting for you to notice them. And if you do, they grow. I kept moving like nothing had happened. That was my first mistake, maybe my biggest one. I didn't ask him why he didn't laugh, didn't reach for him, didn't say something soft to balance out the sharpness of what I'd just thrown at him. Instead, I let it slide away, pretended it was nothing, and assumed he'd do the same. I think part of me believed he would, but things started shifting in ways I couldn't ignore. It wasn't big at first, just little things. He stopped lingering in the kitchen after dinner. Used to be he'd hang around, refill my glass of wine, maybe steal a bite off my plate if I left it unattended too long. But now he'd finish his meal, set his plate in the sink without a word, and head to the couch. The first time I barely noticed. The second time I told myself he was probably just tired. By the fourth or fifth time I started feeling it. That emptiness where something used to be. I started paying attention, not in a full-on paranoid way. Just little glances, little moments where I watched him instead of assuming. Like when we were getting ready for bed one night and he spent a long time in front of the mirror, touching his jaw, smoothing his hand over the fine lines around his mouth. He never used to do that, or when he started going for walks after work alone. He'd never been that kind of guy. He wasn't into solo time. He liked doing things together, movies, errands, hell, even just sitting next to each other in the same room. But now he was stepping away. I wish I could say I asked him about it, that I pulled him aside one night and said, "Hey, I feel like something's different. Are you okay?" But I didn't. Instead, I told myself I was imagining it, that this was just a phase, that maybe I was the one who needed to let things breathe a little, loosen up, not make a big deal out of nothing. And then one night I caught myself before I made another joke. We were sitting on the couch watching TV. Some show we used to love but had both sort of drifted from. He wasn't really paying attention, scrolling on his phone more than watching. I saw a picture pop up, something about a gym, some fitness article, and the words almost left my mouth before I caught them. Something teasing, something lighthearted, something like trying to keep up with the young guys, huh? But this time I stopped. And that's when I knew, because if I had to stop myself, it meant something was already broken. I glanced at him, at the way he was focused on his screen, completely unaware of the war happening in my head. And for the first time, I let myself ask the real question. Was this actually about him getting older, or was this about me? Because the truth I didn't want to say out loud, the thing I had been dodging even as I ran headfirst into it, was that I had felt something too. Restlessness. Not boredom exactly, but close. We were comfortable. He had routines, habits, inside jokes that had lasted longer than some people's entire relationships. And yet there was something else, something hovering just beneath the surface that I couldn't quite grab onto. I didn't want new, I didn't want different, but I wanted more, and maybe, just maybe, Mark had started wanting it too. The thought made me feel sick. I shifted, turned toward him. Hey, I said, too soft, too uncertain. He looked up, eyebrows raised. What's up? I opened my mouth. Almost said it, almost asked if he was okay, if we were okay. And then I didn't. Nothing, I said instead, shaking my head, just thinking. He smiled a little, but it didn't reach his eyes. Thinking about what? I shrugged. I don't know, life. Mark chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Yeah, me too. He looked back at his phone, and for the first time I felt something shift in my chest, a tiny sinking feeling. The kind you don't notice until it's too late. I think I already knew even then. I just wasn't ready to admit it. It's strange, the way things unravel, you don't notice at first. It's like pulling at a loose thread on a sweater, thinking it's just a stray piece of fabric, and then suddenly the whole thing is coming apart in your hands. Mark and I kept moving through our days like nothing was wrong. We still had our routines, work, dinner, the occasional night out with friends. We still talked, but it was surface level. Nothing that pressed too hard. Nothing that made either of us look too closely at the space between us. But the space was there. And it was growing. I should have done something then, asked the hard questions, pushed for honesty. But I didn't, because there was a part of me that was still clinging to the idea that this was just a phase, a weird lull in the rhythm of a long marriage. And then I made the joke. The second one, I don't know why I didn't learn my lesson the first time. Maybe I thought if I laughed, he would too. Maybe I thought if I said it out loud, it would make it less real. We were out to dinner, just the two of us. It wasn't a date night, those had stopped being a thing somewhere along the way. It was just convenient. Neither of us felt like cooking, so we picked a place nearby. It was fine. That's the only word I have for it. The kind of meal you barely remember because nothing about it stands out. And then, out of nowhere, I said it. You sure you don't want to split a salad or something? Gotta keep that heart young, right? It was a joke, But the second it left my mouth, I wanted to pull it back. Mark looked at me, not the way he used to, not amused, not annoyed, just quiet, and then he nodded, slow and deliberate. Yeah, he said, picking up his drink. Maybe I should. I don't know what I expected him to say. Some sarcastic remark maybe, a roll of his eyes, a laugh, but instead he just took a sip of his drink and looked away. And for the first time I felt it. The moment when something small turns into something permanent. The moment when you realize you can't fix something because it's already broken. We finished dinner, drove home, barely spoke. That night I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, feeling the distance between us like an open wound. I wanted to reach for him, to say something, but I didn't. And neither did he. The silence between us didn't come all at once. It crept in slow and steady, settling into the spaces where conversation used to be. I started noticing how often Mark didn't speak. Not just to me, but in general. He was always a talker, the kind of man who had opinions about everything, who would launch into a debate over the best way to brew coffee or the proper way to load a dishwasher. But now he was careful, measured. Like every word he said had weight, and he wasn't sure if it was worth spending on me. I caught myself watching him the way you watch a stranger on the train, trying to figure them out without being too obvious about it. He was still Mark. Same face, same hands, same way he rubbed his forehead when he was thinking. But there was something else now, something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to ask him what was wrong. Wanted to shake him and demand he tell me why everything suddenly felt like we were standing on opposite sides of a closing door. Instead, I did what I always did. I ignored it. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that marriage had quiet seasons and this was just one of them. That we were fine, just coasting. But then I noticed the way he looked at himself in the mirror. It happened one night after he got out of the shower. I was sitting on the bed, scrolling through my phone, not really paying attention. And then I caught it, just a glimpse. He was standing in front of the mirror, running his hands over his face. Tracing the lines near his eyes, pressing at the skin along his jaw. His expression wasn't one I'd seen before. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't self-pity. It was something closer to realization. Like he was seeing himself differently for the first time. Something cold settled in my stomach. Had he always done that? Had I just never noticed, or was this new? I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what. You look fine felt too dismissive. You're handsome felt like too little too late. So I stayed quiet, and that silence, it wasn't just between us anymore. It was inside him now too. The next morning he left early for work without saying goodbye. I told myself it didn't mean anything. But deep down I knew better. The unraveling had started. And I wasn't sure if I was going to stop it or just let it happen. I told myself I was imagining it. that I was overanalyzing every little thing, twisting normal behavior into something it was. But then came the first real sign. The first thing I couldn't explain away. It was a Tuesday, a nothing day. I got home from work late, groceries in one hand, my phone in the other, already half distracted by some email I shouldn't have been looking at outside of office hours. Mark wasn't in the living room like usual. The TV was off. The house was too quiet. I found him in the bedroom, standing in front of the mirror again, dressed in clothes I hadn't seen him wear in a long time. A fitted button-down, jeans that actually fit him properly instead of the loose, comfortable ones he usually wore. He was adjusting his collar, tilting his head slightly like he was seeing how it looked from different angles. He didn't hear me at first. I leaned against the doorway watching him. "Got a hot date?" I finally said, my tone lighter than I felt. He startled a little just for a second and then smoothed it over. A half smile, casual like it was nothing. "Just meeting up with a friend." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tight. I didn't ask who, I don't know why. Maybe because I thought if I said it out loud, then it would turn into something real. I forced a smile, nodding toward his reflection. "Look at you dressing up, guess I should start worrying." I meant it as a joke, or at least I wanted to. But the second it was out of my mouth, I wished I could take it back, because Mark's face didn't change, not right away. He just looked at me, looked through me like he was considering something. And then just as slowly he turned back to the mirror, adjusted his collar one last time. "You never worried before." He said it so softly I almost didn't hear it. And then he grabbed his jacket, kissed my cheek, absent, automatic, and walked out the door. I stood there long after he left, staring at the empty space where he'd been. For the first time I felt something sharp, something close to panic, because he was right. I hadn't worried before, and now it might already be too late. I didn't ask where he was going, I didn't call or text. I didn't pace by the window like some desperate wife in an old movie. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen table, and scrolled through my phone like I wasn't waiting. But I was. I told myself I was being stupid. Mark wasn't the type. He wasn't the guy who went out looking for something new, something exciting. That wasn't him. At least it never had been. But people change, don't they? Or maybe they don't. Maybe they just get tired of being looked at the same way for too long. I stared at my reflection in the window above the sink. The dim glow of the kitchen light softened the lines on my face, the tiredness in my eyes. I looked fine, normal, just another woman waiting for her husband to come home. But the silence in the house felt different now. And when I finally heard the front door open, something inside me tightened. I didn't get up right away, I let him come to me. He walked in, keys jangling in his hand, kicking off his shoes like he always did. But his eyes, his energy wasn't the same. He seemed lighter, like he'd been somewhere good, like he'd been someone else for a little while. I tried to keep my voice even. "How was your night?" "Fine," he said, glancing at me briefly before moving to the fridge. "Just grabbed a couple of drinks." "Yeah, with who?" The pause was too short for anyone else to catch. "Just an old friend." That's when I knew, not in a full, confirmed everything out in the open kind of way, but I knew, because Mark wasn't a liar, not really, but he could be careful with the truth, and right then he was being too careful. I set my glass down. "Anyone I know?" He hesitated just a second too long. Then, without looking at me, he shut the fridge. "Probably not." That should have been the moment I asked. That should have been the moment I said something real, but I didn't. Instead, I forced a smile, nodded, and watched as he walked past me, heading for the bedroom. It wasn't just that he was seeing someone. It was that deep down I wasn't surprised. And that was worse than anything else. The days after that felt like walking on a frozen lake, knowing the ice was thinning beneath me but pretending it was. I didn't ask him who he was meeting. I didn't press. I told myself it was because I didn't want to be that kind of wife, the suspicious, nagging, insecure type. But the truth, I was afraid of the answer. Because if I asked, he'd either lie or he'd tell me the truth. And I didn't know which one would be worse. So I let it sit there, unspoken, stretching between us like a drawn-out breath neither of us was willing to release. Mark didn't act guilty. He wasn't avoiding me, wasn't tiptoeing around the house like a man hiding something. Anything, he seemed lighter, and that was the part that hurt the most. I expected him to be distant, but instead he was at ease. He started going to the gym after work, started dressing differently, putting effort into himself in a way he hadn't in years. I noticed the small things, a new watch, a fresh haircut, the way he checked his phone just a little too quickly when he thought I wasn't looking. And yet he was still here, still coming home, still sleeping in our bed, like nothing had changed. But something had. I knew it in the way he started looking at me, not with anger, not with resentment, but with absence. Like part of him had already left. One night I tested it, just to see. We were lying in bed, backs turned to each other. I could hear his steady breathing, could feel the warmth of him only inches away. I reached out slowly, carefully, my fingers barely brushing his arm. A small touch, an olive branch. For a second I thought he'd ignore it. But then he shifted, rolling onto his back, looking at the ceiling. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low, even. I swallowed. "Nothing." He exhaled through his nose, then without another word he turned back onto his side. And I knew in that quiet, shattering moment that he wasn't coming back, not really. He was already halfway gone. And the worst part, I had been the one to push him there. I spent the next few days pretending not to notice. pretending that if I didn't acknowledge the shift between us, maybe it would settle back into place on its own. It didn't. Mark was still Mark. He still came home at the usual time. Still asked if I needed anything when he ran errands. Still gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before leaving for work. But it was all muscle memory. Empty gestures that meant nothing because the thing that had once given them weight was gone. I could feel him slipping through my fingers and I wasn't sure if I was supposed to hold on or let go. And then came the moment I couldn't ignore. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was folding laundry, something mindless, something familiar. The TV was on in the background, just noise to fill the space. Mark had stepped out, gym errands, I didn't know, I didn't ask. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't looking for anything. That's what I told myself later after the fact, after the damage had already been done. But my hands moved on their own. I reached for it. The screen was still lit up, just a name, just a preview of a message. It wasn't one I recognized. Sophie. The message was simple, harmless if I wanted to lie to myself. Let me know when you're free next week. No pressure. I stared at the words, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I could have put the phone down. I could have walked away. Instead, my hands moved again, faster this time. I swiped up. The messages opened. I shouldn't have looked, I know that now, but I did. There weren't pages of texts. No long, drawn-out confessions of love, no elaborate plans for a future without me, but it was enough. Hey, it was really good seeing you. I didn't realize how much I missed talking like that. Same here, you're easy to talk to. I don't think I've laughed like that in a while. We should do it again. And then the last one, from her. I'd like that. I dropped the phone like it burned me. My hands were shaking. My vision blurred at the edges. I wanted to tell myself this wasn't what it looked like, that this was just an old friend, that I was reading too much into it. But I knew better because I knew Mark. And I knew that he wasn't the type to chase something unless he already knew deep down that he wanted it. I sat there staring at his phone, at the proof of something I already felt in my bones. Mark had met someone. And whether or not he had crossed the line yet, whether or not he had touched her, kissed her, loved her, he was already leaving me for her, piece by piece. And I had let it happen. I didn't say anything. Not that night, not the next day, not even when Mark walked through the door with that same lightness in his step, the one I had been pretending not to see. I wanted to. I wanted to throw his phone at him, demand to know who she was when it started, how long he had been looking at me like I was something familiar and tired while she got to be something new. But I didn't, because the second I opened my mouth it would be real, and I wasn't ready for real, so instead I sat with it. I carried it like a weight in my chest, suffocating but steady. I told myself I needed time. Time to figure out what I was going to say, how I was going to frame it, how I was going to make him see what he was doing. And then 3 days later I saw her. I wasn't looking for her. I wasn't following him or snooping or checking his phone again, though God knows I had to fight the urge. I was just running errands, picking up groceries, same as any other Tuesday. And then right there in the parking lot of some cafe I had never been to, I saw him. Mark, standing on the sidewalk. Talking to a woman. I froze. She was younger. Of course she was, not so much younger that it looked ridiculous, but enough that I noticed. Enough that I felt it like a slap. I couldn't hear them, couldn't make out what they were saying, but I didn't need to. I saw the way she looked at him, and worse than anything was the way he looked at her. Easy, light, like the man I used to know. Like the man he hadn't been with me in a long time. I should have stormed over there. Should have made a scene, should have forced him to say out loud what we were both pretending wasn't happening. But I didn't. I just stood there, my nails digging into my palms, my heart hammering, and I watched. She touched his arm. It was small, brief, but I saw the way he didn't pull away. And then he smiled at her, a real smile. One I hadn't seen in months, maybe longer. I turned around before they could see me. I walked straight to my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. And then, for the first time since this whole thing started, since the joke, since the distance, since the first moment I realized I was losing him, I cried, because there was no more pretending. Mark wasn't just slipping away, he was already gone. I didn't confront him that night. I thought I would. I thought I'd walk through the door, stand in front of him, say her name, Sophie, and watch the truth unfold in real time. But when I got home, I couldn't do it. Mark was already there, sitting on the couch, TV on but barely watching. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his shoes kicked off in that careless way he always did when he was comfortable. Like nothing had changed. Like he hadn't just stood on a sidewalk smiling at another woman like she was the best thing that had happened to him in years. Maybe she was. The thought made my stomach twist, but I forced it down. Hey, he said when he saw me, his voice easy, casual, like everything was fine. Like we were fine. Hey, I answered, matching his tone. I walked into the kitchen, set the grocery bag down, and just stood there for a second, my hands gripping the counter. I could feel it pressing against my ribs, the weight of knowing. But I wasn't ready for the fight, not yet, so I did what I'd always done. I swallowed it. And life kept moving. Days passed, maybe a week. I stopped counting. Mark didn't change anything. He still came home at the same time. Still sat across from me at dinner, making small talk, acting like everything was normal. But it was. I could feel it in my bones. I started testing him in small ways, looking for cracks. I asked if he wanted to go out to dinner, just the two of us, somewhere nice. He hesitated, just for a second. Maybe another night, he said. I nodded like it didn't matter, like I hadn't already seen where his time was going. One night, I reached for his phone while he was in the shower. I told myself I wouldn't look, I just wanted to see if he still kept it face down when he set it on the nightstand. He did. That told me everything I needed to know. I started watching him more carefully, studying him like he was a puzzle I used to know how to put together but had somehow forgot. He was getting sharper. New clothes, new cologne, new routines. He was different but not for me. And the worst part, I knew he was waiting for me to say something. I could see it in his eyes sometimes, the way they lingered on me just a little too long, like he was bracing for the moment I finally called him out. But I didn't, because the truth was I didn't know what I wanted more, to hear him deny it or to hear him admit it. In either way, once the words were out, we couldn't take them back. So I stayed quiet. And the distance between us, the one I had been pretending wasn't there for months, stretched wider, until there was nothing left to cross. The night it finally happened, I think we both knew it was coming. It wasn't some dramatic explosion, no screaming match, no accusations thrown like knives across the room. It was quieter than that, more final. Mark came home late, not too late, nothing obvious, nothing suspicious enough for an excuse. Just past dinner, past the window where a husband who wants to be home would have made sure to be. I was sitting at the table, my plate still in front of me, barely touched. I hadn't been able to eat. He walked in, set his keys on the counter, and when he turned to look at me, I knew, and I knew he wasn't going to lie. Hey, he said, his voice cautious. I let the silence sit between us. Let it stretch heavy and waited until he shifted on his feet. Where were you? I finally asked. He didn't answer right away. He glanced at the table, then at my face like he was measuring how much truth I could take. Out, he said, just out. I nodded, a bitter smile curling at the edge of my mouth. Right. His jaw tightened. Lena, I held up a hand. Don't. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. What do you want me to say? The way he said it, like he was tired, like he had already lived through this moment in his head 100 times before actually stepping into it, made something snap inside me. I pushed my chair back, stood up. I want you to tell me the truth, I said, for once. Mark's eyes flickered, something unreadable crossing his face. He knew he couldn't lie, not anymore. He swallowed, looking down for a second before meeting my gaze again. It's not what you think, he said. I laughed, sharp and humorless. Oh, really? Then tell me, what am I thinking? He pressed his lips together, exhaling through his nose. I didn't cheat on you, Lena. I stared at him. But you wanted to, I said. Silence. He didn't deny it. That was all the answer I needed. I felt my chest cave in, but I forced myself to keep standing, keep breathing, keep seeing him for what he was now. Not my husband, not the man I thought would be next to me forever, just someone who had already started letting me go. I swallowed hard. Who is she? Mark hesitated. And that hesitation hurt, because it meant he was protecting her. Not me, not us, her. Sophie, he said finally, and the sound of her name coming from his mouth was like a final nail in something I hadn't realized we had already buried. I nodded slowly, my throat burning. Right, more silence. Then softer, it wasn't supposed to happen like this. I almost laughed, like this. Like there was a version of this where it was okay. Like there was any way this didn't end exactly where we were standing now. I turned away, pressing my hands against the back of the chair to keep them from shaking. Do you love her? I asked. The words barely made it past my lips. They felt too big, too real. Mark hesitated again, just long enough. I don't know, he said, and that was worse than yes. Because it meant he was already thinking about it, because it meant he had given himself permission to find out. I closed my eyes. Then go, Mark stiffened. Lena, I turned back to him, the grief in my chest hardening into something heavier, something closer to resignation. If you're already asking yourself that question, then you're already halfway there. His face twisted, his hands forming fists at his sides. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. My voice broke. You made it that simple. Mark's shoulders slumped, his whole body seeming to deflate. For a second, I thought maybe he'd fight for us. Maybe he'd say the right thing, do the right thing, take it all back. But he didn't, because we were past that. I had spent months pretending not to see what was happening. And now I couldn't pretend anymore. I swallowed, stepping back. Go, I said again, quieter this time. Mark didn't move, not right away, but after a long, excruciating moment, he nodded. And then without another word, he walked past me, grabbed his keys and left. No suitcase. No final words, just gone. I stood in the empty house, staring at the door he had just walked through. And for the first time in months, I felt the full weight of it. Not just that he had left, but that somehow I had let him. The house felt different after he left. Not empty exactly, just wrong. Like a place I didn't recognize, like a life I had stepped into by accident. I didn't cry, I thought I would. I thought the second the door shut behind him, I'd collapse, feel something big and dramatic and impossible to contain. But instead, there was just this strange, awful stillness. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, listening to the hum of the fridge, the faint tick of the clock. It had never felt so quiet. It wasn't just Mark that was gone, it was everything. The easy conversations, the weight of him next to me in bed, the history that had filled every inch of this house, stitched into the routines we didn't even think about until they weren't there anymore. I thought about the last time we'd been happy, really happy. When was that? A year ago, 5. Had it been slipping away for longer than I realized? Had I just not seen it? Or worse, had I seen it and just convinced myself it didn't matter? I stood up too fast. My chair scraped against the floor, the noise too sharp in the silence. I needed to move, to do something. I walked to the bedroom. The bed was still made the way I had left it this morning, but now it felt different. Like a place I didn't belong anymore. Like it was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I opened his closet, just stood there staring. His clothes were still there. His shoes lined up neatly at the bottom. His cologne sitting on the dresser, the same one he'd worn for years. The one I used to love. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. I should have thrown it. Should have shattered the bottle against the wall, let the smell of him flood the room, let the anger hit me all at once. But I didn't. Instead, I set it back down, closed the closet door, and walked away. Because it didn't matter anymore, because I had already lost him. And now I had to figure out who I was without him. The problem was I wasn't sure I knew. The first morning without him, I woke up before my alarm. For a split second, I forgot. I turned over expecting warmth beside me, the faint weight of his breathing filling the room. But instead there was nothing, just empty sheets. And then it hit me all over again. He was gone. I lay there staring at the ceiling, willing myself to move. But my body felt heavy, my limbs uncooperative. The silence in the house felt louder than it should have, stretching into every corner. It wasn't just that he wasn't here. It was that he had chosen not to be. I could have stayed in bed, could have let myself sink into the weight of it, but instead I forced myself up. I moved through the morning like a stranger in my own life. Shower, coffee, clothes. Usual motions, but without any real thought behind them. I almost made 2 cups of coffee out of habit, caught myself just before pouring the second one. Little things like that kept happening all morning. I reached for my phone to text him something about the electricity bill, stopped myself, turned on the TV while eating breakfast, expecting him to come in and change the channel like he always did. Remembered he wouldn't. And then the worst part. I checked his location. I didn't mean to. It was automatic muscle memory. I had never even thought about it before. But now it felt invasive. It loaded too slowly, dragging out the moment, making my pulse pound in my ears. And then there it was, not at work, not at the gym, somewhere I didn't recognize, somewhere I knew deep down wasn't just anywhere. I stared at the screen, at the tiny dot that represented him, and felt something sink inside me. I could call him. I could demand answers. I could scream, cry, make him feel the way I felt right now, but I wouldn't, because that was the difference between us. He had already moved forward, and I was still standing here trying to figure out when exactly I had been left behind. I didn't check his location again, not because I didn't want to, not because the urge didn't sit in the back of my mind, pressing against my ribs every time I picked up my phone, but because I already knew what I would find. Mark was somewhere else. With someone else, and there was nothing left to do but accept it. Acceptance. The word felt hollow, like something people said when they wanted grief to be neater than it really was. I wasn't there yet. I wasn't sure if I ever would be, but I had to start somewhere. So I started with the house. The second night after he left, I pulled everything of his out of the closet. His shirts, his shoes, his stupid gym bag that still smelled like whatever overpriced protein powder he had been obsessed with lately. I piled it all on the bed and just stared. I expected to feel anger, to want to rip the fabric, throw things, make some dramatic scene like in a movie. But all I felt was tired. Because the truth was, this wasn't about Sophie. It wasn't about the late nights, the gym, the messages on his phone. It was about us, how we had let things slip. How we had stopped seeing each other. I had spent so much time thinking about what he had done, about who he had done it with, that I hadn't asked the harder question. Why did he want to leave? And even worse, why hadn't I fought for him to stay? I sank down onto the bed, surrounded by pieces of him, and realized the answer wasn't simple. I had loved Mark. I still did. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped showing it. I had let the days blur together, let comfort turn into complacency, let love turn into something assumed instead of something nurtured. And so had he. Maybe he had met Sophie by accident. Maybe she was nothing more than a reminder of what it felt like to be seen, to be chosen, to be wanted. And maybe that was all he had needed to go. I took a deep breath, picked up the first shirt, and started folding. Not out of forgiveness, not out of understanding, but because I needed to let him go. And for the first time, I wondered if I was ready. I didn't hear from him for a while, not in the way that mattered anyway. There were a few texts, brief and transactional, logistics, bank accounts. What he wanted to pick up from the house, nothing personal, nothing real, and that hurt more than I expected, not because I wanted him back, not because I wanted to fix things, but because it made it clear that there was nothing left to fix. We had unraveled so quietly, so slowly, that by the time the last thread snapped, neither of us had reached out to grab it. And maybe that was the part I couldn't stop thinking about. It wasn't the affair, it was Sophie. It wasn't the way he had pulled away, the way I had let him. It was that we had both let it happen. I sat with that realization for days, weeks. I let it settle into me, into the quiet of the house, into the new rhythm of mornings without him, nights without the weight of his body beside me. And I didn't cry over it, not anymore. Instead, I started doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I thought about myself, who I had been before him, who I was now, what I had wanted. what I had given up, and I realized something. For so long I had blamed him for leaving, for choosing someone else. For seeing in her what he had stopped seeing in me, but I had stopped seeing myself. I had stopped looking at my own reflection with anything other than criticism, stopped wanting more for myself because I had settled into the comfort of routine. I had been restless, but I hadn't acted. I had wanted change, but I had been too afraid to ask for it. And maybe deep down, that had been the difference between us. Mark had reached for something new, and I had been standing still. Now there was nothing left to hold on to, and for the first time that didn't scare me. It set me free. I didn't know what was next. I didn't know how long it would take to feel normal again, to stop waking up and expecting him to be there, to stop measuring my life against the absence of him. But I did know this: I was still here, still standing, still whole, and for now that was enough.